Aman, so glad to meet you again today. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be back with you here, Deepak.
Yeah, awesome. So I thought, today's podcast, we can cover three main topics. Let me know what your thoughts are. There's this whole trend that is happening, which is the agentic AI revolution, right? So I thought we can start with that, hear what your take is on that whole trend. And then from there, we dive into like how companies can build AI products and adjust to this trend. And then how do people change, right? Like, especially product managers, what do they need to like account for?
Yeah, it sounds great. Happy to dive into. I feel like I keep seeing 2025 as the year of agents, and I think for a lot of people, it might be scratching their head like, what does that exactly mean for me? So it's definitely been on my mind to try and decompose that a bit more.
Awesome. All right. So, question one, as we start with the macro trend, everybody is hearing that there are humans that are accessing the web and accessing applications. And now there's a new type of user, which is AI agents, right? Who are also going to start accessing the web and platforms. Like we have seen Operator and we have seen like some of the demos. What is your sense, someone like how is the world changing? Are we seeing agents as a new type of user now on platforms?
Yeah, so it might be helpful to define agents as well, just for folks that are maybe they're like a little bit familiar, and we can definition to revisit, when we talk about some of the product implications. So an agent generally is a system that kind of comprises of three parts. There's and it might be helpful to use an example here. Let's assume you have, some type of chatbot you're interacting with, and you wanted to like book a trip, for example, like a trip planning agent. So that agent is going to basically consist of three things, which is you give it a question like, I want to book a trip to San Francisco, and it will reason about what you're asking for. Okay, well, what are the components of a trip? Does this involve a flight? Does it involve a hotel? What are the things might need to ask from the user to understand better what they're looking for from this trip? So that's the first component. It's really reasoning. Based on that back and forth, or based on the information the agent has, the next component is really around tool selection, which is understanding what can the agent actually do. Think of this as sort of like a human being as well. Like, can I go type into a keyboard or interact with the web browser and navigate to a certain site? Are there APIs that are exposed that I can utilize? And then the last but not least is really just taking the action and establishing, is what the agent doing correct or not? And along each of the steps of this journey, agents can kind of go into loops or pick the wrong tool, reason about something incorrectly. What that ends up looking like is you might get a flight to San Diego instead of San Francisco. And so that's kind of a classic example of, the agent might even get most of the steps right along the way, but if it gets one step incorrect, you can end up with a completely different outcome. I'm sure most people have experienced this in some way. I just hit this myself this last week, like trying to rebook a flight because of weather delays. And you just get stuck in this like chatbot loop of like, I'm sorry, I can't help you with that. And I'm like, oh my God, like if I was just talking to a real human being, this would be so much easier. That's probably because the agent either isn't reasoning correctly, or it doesn't have access to the right tools to actually take the action that you want it to. So with that definition in place, I think it's pretty safe to assume that a lot of the tasks that require pointing and clicking and taking actions with keyboards, with with a laptop or with some type of machine, a lot of those workflows are actually going to start moving towards being agentic in some way. And so, to the kind of the crux of your question, if I interpret it correctly, is should we be designing for agents or humans in the future? And like, what does that time frame look like? And what percentage of actions on the internet are going to be taken by agents versus humans in the future? And so that's really the interesting sort of like, there's so many ways to break that down further into each of those steps of everyone is racing towards improving reasoning. That's why you're seeing all of these investments and billions of dollars going towards training and inference. But there's this whole second component, which is access to tools, APIs, the right data, the right modalities to actually make sense of all of the we're asking. And then there's actually the actions and taking action itself and interacting with the UIs and APIs. So I think there's a long way to go, but I do think that we're sort of seeing this trend of each of those areas being, kind of decomposed into more and more products and people being able to build around them as well.
I love how you broke it down, right? On one hand, you said reasoning and computer use. that's not enough. Like applications themselves need to be agent ready, which means maybe the APIs need to be LLM ready, maybe authentication, permissions, all of that. And that's the part I think companies are figuring out, right? Like how do I make my current products agent ready so they always book a flight to San Francisco if you want them to and not to San Diego, right? So is that a problem statement that a lot of companies are dealing with right now? This
Yeah,
make
so that's a great question. So I mean, I think at this stage where a lot of companies are is kind of where and just for context as well, myself in my day job, I work a lot with product managers that are trying to get their AI applications from, experiments which are like local, maybe running on a notebook, running on a local machine, and actually getting those into production. So these are product builders that are pretty, fairly early in their life cycle, but there's sort of a spectrum where we see agents all the way into production and folks wanting to add more tools and capabilities there and more advanced use cases. That's sort of the long tail. But the majority of folks are still in that like early wave of just trying to get their first agents to production, actually doing what you want it to do. And it's funny, the trip planner is a great use case. We do have some, customers that have trip planners that they're using, our tools for evaluation and experimentation on as well. So we're actually helping them get more use cases online, from that first one in production. I think where most folks are sitting is they're trying to grapple around, okay, I have this idea of what an agent could do for my platform. I have an idea, a business idea of what I'd like the agent to do. And they're trying to pick the right tools and sort of connect the components together correctly to get to that end outcome. And there is this massive valley in the middle. I think we're seeing, a good example of that is if you take a look at deep research. And I went ahead and opened up my credit card, actually splurged, paid for the OpenAI version, though I know that there are some open source versions of deep research, which is sort of a web crawler plus search engine plus reasoning agent that you can use to, maybe ask an open-ended question and get information from different sources. That's an example of the types of tools and capabilities that are still really early today, but have a lot of potential if you connect them to the right endpoints to actually take action. So I think we're seeing this explosive sort of investment in reasoning, in being able to get data to the right places. And the sort of next obvious area for investment, which makes sense, is how do you take action with the information that you have? So I do think that that's an area where people are starting to, think more about and how to build the right tools.
Yeah. Love that. Love that. So it's not just LLM territory. It's not just foundational model territory. Every website, every application also needs to start thinking of this and make their tools accessible for agents to do deep reasoning and actions as well. So that's great. I think that's a good segue, Aman, into my next section, which is building AI products, right? Every company that I'm talking to right now, I don't know if you're seeing the same thing. Every company I'm talking to, I think their roadmaps have changed. Most of the roadmap is an AI roadmap right now. Are you seeing that change too?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of an interesting question around like product roadmaps. Like when I started my career as a PM, it was all about, strategy and execution. Your strategy needs to be a 1 year roadmap and you break that up into quarters and you turn that into sprints. And I feel like that whole system has been turned on its head a little bit where, your AI strategy is probably more important than the roadmap itself in the sense that the tools are going to keep changing in front of you. And the things that you thought weren't important right now will become more important earlier. And we're seeing that even with evals, right, ourselves, which is, before evals and observability used to be this like afterthought, last mile problem. You get everything strung up correctly, and then you can evaluate the system. But the truth is that if you actually want this thing to work the way you expect it to, it's so much more important to get observability in evals right in that first mile than it is even in the last mile. And you can kind of take all of those learnings and apply them with you through production. So the short answer to your question is like, I kind of wonder, like, what does a roadmap even look like anymore? I just think that, a strategy, which is, being adaptive to what is the latest technology in AI, trying it out for yourself and trying to understand, is this something that could impact my business or in the future? And then trying to upskill yourself and the workers that are around you to actually have that same intuition. That seems more like a robust roadmap to me than, we need to ship an agent this year, because we really just have no idea based on the use case if that's even going to be possible or not.
Yeah, I think long-term moats are becoming so much more important than just like AI features that you're sprinkling on your product. So
Totally.
yeah. agree with that. So a lot of, I think the first version that companies built into the products was a chatbot, right? That was basically answering questions with knowledge base articles and maybe doing a little bit of predictions on that. Is that is that a sustainable lead? Maybe like another way to ask the question is, what do you think? Like companies, like you said, there's an AI strategy that they should be looking at, right? So should they like rethink their whole product, start building autonomous agents, co-pilots, or do they continue to build AI features on their product? Like, what do you think they should be doing?
Yeah. And maybe like another way to reframe the question, and curious of your take on this, is like, what's the right interface for AI, right? So like if you're a product builder and you're thinking, okay, I have this tool, it's sort of like a hammer and everything's a nail. What's actually the right interface to apply this in my business to some degree? Is that sort of like curious, like what you're seeing there, and if that's something that's, you're kind of also resonating with?
I would say so because the interface today, as we see it, right, or maybe like in the past few years, has we've always talked about a UI UX layer where humans access. That's the interface. The tools are APIs. The tools
Yeah.
are components that you're building, but the interface itself is changing now, right? So
Right.
people talk about agent experience being the new interface, new UX. So yeah, so part of the question is also about how do you adjust.
Yeah. And I think I I'll kind of say like the fundamental goal of a product person is really to keep their customer in mind and what the customer is trying to do. And I think the way that you might define a customer in the next few years starts to look a little bit different as well. So I'll give you an example of that. So when if you imagine like way back in, let's say, a few hundred years ago, what was the way to communicate information from, if I wanted to talk to you, for instance, and you're in San Jose and I'm in New York, what would be the way that I would communicate with you? Well, I'd have to go and find you and talk to you, right? I'd have to go talk to you in person and say, hey, how's it going, Deepak? I'd really like this product or service, or what do you think of this idea? Well, along came this concept of people that were messengers, right? And that's sort of like, you can imagine like back in the days of like kingdoms, right? There were people, don't shoot the messenger. It was like the classic expression. Okay, so what is a messenger? It's this intermediary between me trying to communicate an idea to you. And then eventually the messenger got displaced with a telegram, which is a way to communicate that using, electricity and using signals. And then now we have the internet. And so I think that the new internet actually starts to look like agents, which are intermediaries between me wanting to purchase something or solve a problem or get some information and the source of that, where there might be some back and forth. It's not just as simple as sending a message and getting a request back. There might be multiple back and forths. In fact, there might be multiple agents along the layers of me actually solving a problem or getting the answer I'm looking for. And so I think that that's really, we're first seeing this like first rise of agents now. Like everyone's going to have some first agent. Every product will have some first agent that they're interacting with. But eventually there's a second order effect of, is your product actually being used by humans, or is it being used by agents? And then eventually, if your product is an agent, how many agents or what are the types of agents are that are actually interacting with your product or service? And so I think it's sort of this like cascading effect of thinking about, okay, today I have a website, I have a UI, I have APIs where developers will go in and access the information that I'm offering. But in the future, in the kind of in the immediate future, it's more likely that you're going to have more autonomous systems interacting with those, sort of UIs and APIs. And there might be a human on the other end, right? It might be a supervised agent, and most likely will be supervised for some period of time. But as we kind of move towards this future, there's going to be more of these intermediate agents communicating with each other. So that's how I kind of view the world, which is, right now we're sort of seeing the first step along, this explosion of technology.
Very interesting. And I think supervised agents will also become important in high risk domains like fintech and healthcare and high risk actions. But yeah, but I do see what you're saying. As we get better and better with actions and with reasoning, the need for supervised agents also decreases to a certain extent, and you can have like fully autonomous agents acting on behalf of humans and that go into tasks.
Yeah. I mean, I think, look, my background's in the self-driving space. And so when I started my career for, evaluating agents, what we defined as an agent was a self-driving car. And the stakes were really, really high. Like it's not like just like you serve someone a bad ad and you don't get a click. Like if you get the wrong generation or the wrong prediction, this thing could actually go and hit someone and be really damaging. And so I think today the agents that we see, the right use cases to build around when we're thinking about like what's the right use case to apply I would think about supervised systems that are relatively lower risk initially as you work towards better reliability with evaluation and observability to start approaching those higher risk use cases. There's a ton of value in legal and medical and bio sort of use cases for agents, but actually getting it right on the lower value use cases helps you kind of step up this ladder. So I kind of view it as like stepping up the ladder of what your agent can actually do. Start from the first rung, get it right, get the right systems in place before trying to go and tackle something very advanced.
Yeah, awesome. So the next question, Aman, is, as companies are starting to build these AI products and systems, right? How do they go from an MVP to an enterprise grade product? Maybe you touched upon that a little bit with evals and observability, but what are all the components that you would think of when you're making it enterprise grade?
Right. So, I mean, I think that it really depends a lot on the use case, but there's a few core components I can kind of, folks are starting to use to really make decisions around. So I'll kind of start with like three high level components, and then there's sort of one, subcomponents underneath that a little bit. But the three are really the framework you're going to use for the agent, the memory or the data that the agent is going to access, and then the observability layer on top of all of that to make sure your agent is making the right decision. And we'll kind of go into each of these. So I'm grouping framework and the AI kind of together at this point. But the framework is really like the bones of the system itself. What are the ways that the system is going to be able to access the right, tools, and does it actually have the right understanding encoded in it into what the purpose of the agent is? And so that's sort of the system of prompts. That's the LLM itself. That's actually the sort of the core fundamental software code that is, makes up the agent itself. And so that's sort of one pretty important component, but this thing can't operate in a vacuum, right? Like having a cool agent you can talk to and have a good discussion with is like just not enough to actually go and do the execution and using tools. When I think about memory and the data layer that the agent has access to, this is where, at the end of the day, the agent needs to actually take some action on behalf of a user. And that's where having access to the right data and the APIs and knowledge and memory, which is core to your business, is really, really critical to get right. So an example of that is, let's just take like a simple like web crawling agent, right? So if you've used deep research, it's pretty interesting to see this because the system is multimodal and because the system can actually, take action by making a search, navigating to a web page. And sometimes you'll actually see it hit this problem where it's like, I can't parse this page. I don't understand the context on this page. I have to move on to the next page. And what's it actually trying to do? If you ask it a question, it's like, should I go to place A versus place B? Here's my requirements. And it's going to all these different travel blogs and trying to pick out useful information. What's happening is that some of those blogs are optimized for the agent to act information, and some of them aren't. Now, imagine that you are the owner of one of those blogs and you're getting revenue based on clicks, based on impressions, based on recommendations to certain restaurants or places. If your page isn't optimized for agents to actually go and take advantage of it and take advantage of the information you've so carefully curated and you've put so much love and attention into getting the right, the right impressions and the right recommendations in there, at the end of the day, it's not going to matter, right? And so there's this optimization that you have to think about as an agent builder for what data do I need for my agent? And then as an actual service provider, is my service actually optimized for agents to take advantage of it? And then I think if you're actually going to ship this agent, the really important critical layer on top of this is understanding what your agent is actually doing. And again, I think deep research, I kind of pick on it because it's a pretty good tool to kind of use to understand how these agents work at the most simple level. But you can actually kind of click this like down arrow and see all of the chain of thought reasoning steps that the agent is taking. And that's like a very, very simple view into observability. Now, that's like a sort of human interpretable view of like chain of thought reasoning, but that view is not going to give you enough insight into what data is the agent picking out specifically? Is it using citations correctly? is it reasoning the correct way? Do I have the right checks in place as the agent is going about solving this problem for me to go and understand what to go and improve on? Should I pick Claude versus, GPT-4o, or maybe the new Vertex model? Well, to actually be able to make that decision, you actually need observability every step of the way. And that includes evals, which is basically using another agent or LLM system to understand if your agent is taking the right actions. And so that's a really critical fundamental step from the earliest parts of when you're building, so that when you're actually making improvements, it's making a difference and you're not just going off and trying to solve a problem that the agent doesn't actually have. So those are kind of the three main components I think of when you think about an agent being applied to a product and not just the agent itself.
Awesome. So frameworks, memory, and then the observability layer. Awesome.
Exactly.
So when companies are looking at building AI products and capabilities, right? There's a lot of companies that come and sell to them. They say, hey, don't try to build everything in-house. Don't boil the ocean. So how should companies apply the lens of what to build versus what to buy?
Yeah. Well, I do think that there's a certain degree of you do, if you're, and like, it's probably helpful to make this like tactical, right? So like if you are a PM at a company, let's say you're building a support bot agent. It can be more interesting than that. Maybe you want to make it like, it's recommending different products or services as well. So it's not just a support bot. You're building an agent that's like actually kind of, improving someone's day and recommending services. I'm seeing a bunch of these like AI clone types of agents, right? So let's say you're like a PM at one of those companies. Well, I do think it's really important to weigh what the culture of the company is. And so it's sort of, what are the principles that you're using to make decisions as a company? And the reason I say that is because, many times you kind of want to get to an answer as quickly as possible. And so you're trying to cut down on the iteration loop. You're trying to bring the cost of iteration down to zero as much as possible. So what's the fastest way for you to get signal? Is that signal actually true? Which means, can you actually go test it in the market and get some real customer feedback if the agent you're building is actually useful? And then once you actually get that feedback, how quick is it for you to actually take that data and go back and iterate? So do you have the right feedback loops in place? So I kind of view this as like, these are the principles we use at startups to basically understand, and startups I've worked at, which are basically to decompress the amount of time it takes for you to actually get a product out the door, get feedback, and then iterate. But if you're at a medium or larger enterprise, your decisions might look really different, right? So if you're working at Google, the principles that you're using for product building might look more like, is this the right decision strategically for us to put 100 people to go work on for the next year? And so when you're picking the right tool or vendor, those are the considerations you might need to have. And so I think it's really important to really pull what the culture and principles of your product organization are. And then I'll kind of give a tip in there or a hint, which is you can actually get pretty far with open source these days. Like actually going and needing to buy a tool is usually, if you're a large enterprise that requires security or support, it makes sense to go and maybe have a white glove experience. But it's a lot like saying like, do I need a used car that kind of does the job where I can like bolt things onto and make it mine and adapt it? Or do I really need that top of the line Mercedes? And I think you really got to ask yourself, what's going to get me from point A to point B the fastest? And does it matter that I need to go and spend all this money to get there if you're really going to get there in the same amount of time? So for us, we actually open source quite a bit of our own technology. So the product is called Phoenix. So it's sort of like Phoenix Arises. And it's an open source observability and eval tool where you can get a lot of the way pretty far, but basically understanding what your app is doing and running evals on top of it without needing a fancy enterprise product just yet. Eventually, you might decide, I want that white glove experience. I want that Mercedes. But at least then you'll know what you need versus when you're just getting started. It's sort of like, it's your first car. Like, do you really need the top of the line car or not? So.
Awesome. Great. So let's move on to the next topic, which is evolution of product management. Now we talked about the trend, we talked about companies building AI products. What should PMs be doing? Like, should every PM become an AI PM? And I know you talked about this in a previous blog and podcast, but love to our viewers listen.
Yeah. So I think it's I think there's this analogy I really like, which is like, I kind of view this year sort of as an opportunity for, it's sort of a surfing analogy, but it's an opportunity for PMs to really be on the right spot on the wave, which means, are they really paddling towards the area where there's a lot of opportunity for them in their career. And look, I had to do that myself. I didn't have a technical background in AI when I started my career, but I did up level. I took courses on deep learning AI, and I watched a lot of YouTube videos from Andrej Karpathy and other professors on the fundamentals of the technology. I think that there's kind of three components that make it kind of can have an impact on really like three short components, and then a couple more that I'll add on that are sort of bonus there. And that's having the right knowledge, having curiosity, and then just trying the tool yourself. And so I think having the right knowledge looks like the foundation of actually watching videos, digesting what can AI do versus what are people saying is sort of like hypey. Do I believe that this is the right way to apply AI? And I think that there's a lot of resources that are out there for free that are worth absorbing around, what Andrej Karpathy and deep learning AI kind of cover. And so from there, you can at least develop the intuition of what can this technology do. The next layer is really your own curiosity. So the best thing I can advise there is really just spend some time talking to chatbots about what you're interested in and see where the conversation goes. It's a lot like just talking to an advisor and making someone, sort of picking someone's brain on like, this area is interesting to me. What if I could do this? And you might find it actually applies towards the product that you're building or you're working on. And so I think that it's interesting to see where your curiosity takes you, because that's going to be different for every single person. And then I will say an important component to this is actually trying the tools yourself. Try and go build something. Go build a prototype. Go try and ship something, put it out there in the world and get feedback on it. At the end of the day, isn't that what product management really is? Isn't it just trying to build something and solving a problem for yourself or for someone else you care about, and then seeing what they say and how to make it better? So I think if you connect those components together, you're going to find that your skill set is actually higher than so many other product builders that didn't take those steps. And that puts you at an advantage. I think eventually more and more people are going to start getting there. And you might find that I'm an expert AI PM in this domain, the domain that I care the most about. And that's really what it kind of looks like to upskill yourself as an AI PM. So yeah, at the end of the day, that kind of means everyone's an AI PM, but eventually I think we'll start saying I'm an AI PM for healthcare. I'm an AI PM for fintech. And that's really, I think, when you know that the technology has reached sort of iPhone level.
Awesome. So you kind of upskill yourself. You tap into all the resources available. You do your tests, put your product in the hands of folks, and then learn from it. That's all great stuff. Last question, Aman. You have been an amazing PM yourself, so you know that there's the top PMs think very differently than most of the other PMs. So in the world of AI product management, I'll just go back into what you said earlier. The strategy is more important than the AI strategy, right? You don't want to be a PM just building feature after feature, launching something that is not sticky or will get disrupted. So what advice would you give PMs? Like, what is the lens they have to apply to build a good AI strategy and build features that last?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like if you ask different product builders across different industries, they're going to tell you different pieces of advice. So maybe what I can do is just try to like personalize it. And look, I appreciate all the kind comments there. I think I've been lucky to like be in the right place, building for customers I care a lot about. So like my customers are people that are building with AI. At the end of the day, I kind of like made it my mission to go and make it easier to understand what AI is doing in your business. That's my goal. That's what I live for. I wake up every morning and I think about how do I make it easier for people building with AI to understand what this is actually doing. Is it doing the thing I want it to do? And so the biggest thing I can really suggest for, that has worked for me is to just have insane amounts of customer empathy. And, a lot of people say, oh my God, customer empathy, what does that mean? Like, this word is like overloaded. I can tell you exactly what it means for me, which is you need to feel the success of building, a product that you really, appreciated having and having out in the world and actually having that firsthand experience of building a product that we kind of talked about. But you also need to feel the pain of trying to stitch different pieces together to get that product out there. And so I sign up almost every day and I'll just try our own product and build something for myself and try and attach it to a product that I'm working on or maybe like a side project. And it's super easy to do that now. Before you'd have to like train a model, train a classifier, and then attach it to the product. And it was all these extra steps. But now you can go on Replit, you can go on Vercel and build, a website front end. And from there, what is really important is to understand what's painful about that process. What do I wish was easier? And that's the question you have to keep asking yourself, which is, what's something that is hard that should be easier? What's something I wish was easier that today is hard that should be easier? And I think that for me, it's really comes down to the questions that you ask yourself to develop that empathy. And that's worked for me so far, is just constantly asking myself, what do I wish could, is easier? And there's like a great like Brian Chesky framework of like the 7-star Airbnb experience, the 10-star experience. Like, how could you make it easier and easier and easier? Where like at the end of the day, you want your customer and the person on the other end of the screen or that you're meeting and you're shaking their hand, you want them to feel like they're having a huge impact in their company. And so it's sort of, what can you do to get someone promoted is sort of another way to look at it. And so that's really, for me, it's just that obsession around trying to put myself in the shoes of someone building with AI and trying to make their life easier continuously every single day. It doesn't get any easier. I think it's just hard work. I don't know, Deepak, you tell me, what's your advice there for someone building?
As you were thinking, it was resonating with me because all the products that we all love today are the ones that made our job way, way easier, right?
Right.
So I kind of agree with you. I think from a strategy perspective, I'm with you on this, right? I feel like a lot of companies ship fancy AI features. You really have to rethink how the new world will look like 5-10 years from now and start building that today, right? And you have to have very strong intuition and validate, because sometimes customers are not asking you to build those things yet, right?
Yeah.
Nobody asks an AI to go and build what they build today, right? So having that intuition and that understanding of the market and applying the lens maybe that you applied on how do you make things easier, maybe you put all of them together and come up with a good AI strategy.
Yeah. And there's an interesting kind of addition to what you just said, which is like intuition. And I do think that there's intuition that you can build by just trying good products. It's like, it's like that, basically trying food at a bunch of different restaurants. Eventually you develop your own taste. And I think good products can help you define your own taste as well. So you're not building towards something that like ended up being kind of a crappy experience at the end of the day.
Absolutely. On that note, Aman, I wanted to say thank you. This was so insightful for me, and I'm sure for the whole audience out here. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And feel free to reach out if any of this resonated. Would love to chat with folks that are out there building in the trenches.
All right. Take care, Aman. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.